Welcome back to the series that nobody asked for and has performed monumentally poorly. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that there's no time to hesitate. I need to blaze through this. So first off, even in this series, the acorn worm would often be neglected because most worms are protostomes. Not the acorn worm, it's a deuterostome. The difference between these two is subtle and embryonic, but you'll recognize one contains worms, squids, spiders, while the other contains humans, starfish, and of course, the acorn worms. Acorn worms are thus much more similar to humans than they appear, and certainly much more so than echinoderms, so they're probably the most chordate-like non-chordates, hence the name. The concrete aspect of this subjective statement is that they have 1 out of 5 chordate synapomorphies, namely pharyngeal slits, tubes connecting the pharynx to the outside. In fish, these become gills, and in humans, these disappear except for one pair, which becomes the eustachian tubes in the inner ear. Now, we're not sure if they were parallel or homologous in development, but they're one of the main traits of acorn worms. Beyond that, they can be recognized by their rigid division into 3 distinct segments. But the buck stops there. They have no post-anal tail, an open circulatory system, are fully aquatic, have a larval stage, and really, it's only the benefit of their obscure developmental differences that make them different from protostomes. Strip that away and you'll find a boring D-tier worm. Ribbon worms are another clade of worms I brought up in the last video, which I repeatedly misidentified as annelids, something I sincerely apologize for. Though they are close to them, just on the other side of mollusks, that means they share the remarkable complexity of annelids while only not being segmented. Ribbon worms are most well known for their proboscis, a giant aversible pharynx. Essentially, it looks like this inside them, and then they spit it out. Some annelids can do this, but not remotely to the same scale. Once they do this, venom on the proboscis paralyzes the target and they're sucked back down into their mouth. Ribbon worms share the amazing regenerative abilities of flatworms, being able to regrow an entire body from a small chunk, a feature they use to great extent, some splitting as an instinct to stress, which is why this famous video of multiple ribbon worms is actually just one ribbon worm, which is very much dying. But besides the proboscis thing, they have pretty much default worm lives, although some of them can get really large, particularly the bootlace worm, which is not only the longest worm, but a competitor for the longest animal ever. They don't have particularly interesting life cycles, but I'm in a good mood, so it gets a B tier, nothing more. The Mongolian deathworm is a deadly worm native to the Gobi Desert in northern China. It's not a real animal, it's a cryptid, so that unfortunately means it has to be judged against other cryptids. Now, as far as cryptids go, the Mongolian deathworm is no legend, but I think it's definitely a sleeper. Let's start with the facts. The Mongolian deathworm, or Olgoy Khorkhoy in Mongolian, which means something like intestine worm, is a long red worm. Original accounts put it at 2 feet long, but the legend has of course been expanded upon, literally. It's so poisonous it can kill instantly with a single touch, spits acid, and can shoot lightning, though this last detail is probably made up. Now, in my video about cryptids, the Mongolian deathworm provided a challenge, which I like. It kinda served as the final boss of that video, but I wasn't super satisfied with the answer I got. Also, it could be more of a drop bear scenario where it was made up by the locals at the expense of tourists rather than being a legit cryptid they believe in, which just feels a bit sad how easily we fall into that trap. I mean, not that sad. It still is pretty funny either way, so I will bump it up to A tier. The velvet worm is actually very close to modern arthropods, being placed in, well, these two, along with water bears, make up a group called Panarthropoda. We're not entirely sure which one is where, which I'll get to. Velvet worms, somewhat scandalously, actually do have legs, which are homologous to the legs of insects. In fact, this is what the Latin name is named after. However, rather than having a hard exoskeleton, they have the hydrostatic skeleton that's so characteristic of annelids, so they pass. Now, pretty much the only interesting thing about velvet worms is the mucus thing, which, to be fair, is pretty cool. Beyond these two antennae, velvet worms have 2 small modified legs. These can be used to eject the massive reservoir of mucus the velvet worm has inside its body. This slime is, as many animal byproducts are, the subject of much chemical engineering for its ability to remain viscous in the body while hardening immediately to be similar to Kevlar, but soluble in water, and the velvet worm is able to recycle it. It uses this slime to immobilize prey or predators, then eject venomous saliva until the creature dissolves and can be drunk, much like a spider. So look, I know it's barely a worm. I know that even though it leads to interesting material sciences, that is par for the course in invertebrates. I know it's not even velvet most of the time. But this was never objective. I like it, and so I've got to put it in S tier. So remember when I said this, which I'll get to, Of course you do. It was 43. I shouldn't say timestamps, I know they'll be wrong. Point being, Panarthropoda splits into three groups: water bears, velvet worms, and arthropods. In the scenario where velvet worms are the odd man out, the remaining two become tactopoda, named after their similar legs and muscle structures. If water bears are the odd man out, the remaining two become antennapoda. But the most modern theory is that arthropods are the odd man out, leaving these two together as Lobopodia. Now, before this theory, Lobopodia has long been a wastebasket taxon for any sort of extinct panarthropod, which is what I'll be judging today. Perhaps the most well-known of these is Anomalocaris, but there's a variety of other ones, each more intriguing than the last. Hallucigenia is a worm covered in spikes, Lorlishania is a worm with feathers, Hadronax is a worm with antlers, Omnidens is a freaking spaceship, and Ovatiovermis is, like, I don't even know how to describe this. Lobopodians provide an invaluable window into the development of arthropod limbs, which is probably important given that that's what the entire taxon is named after. And they all have cool names, with the ovating sievworm, stout king of August, mighty dreammaker, and all-toothed giant, which was actually one of my picks for the best Latin name. Except, if I'm being totally honest, does this look like a worm to you? It may be nominally a high tier, but this is the worm tier list, so it will be in D for disqualified. I still can't do it, so I'm putting it in F tier out of spite. The terms Pillworm and Galleyworm are both outdated synonyms used to refer to the millipede. Despite how much these guys clearly resemble the average worm, this was the closest I could get to including them on this list. Immediately after water bears and velvet worms have been paired away, Arthropoda splits. Both clades individually developed a kind of fangs, with the myriapods on the same side as crustaceans and insects, calling them mandibles, as opposed to the chelicerae of ticks, spiders, and scorpions. Millipedes are mostly passive, they even defend themselves simply by curling up. They can produce some dangerous chemicals, mostly cyanide and hydrochloric acid. Although their name means 1,000 feet, it was thought none of them actually made that mark, until we discovered Eumillipes Persephone with 1,306 legs. Of course, the order name 10,000 feet has not yet been proven accurate. But millipedes were much more interesting. Until the fossil record proves otherwise, millipedes were the first animal with a mechanism for breathing air, hence the name, the spiracles that all insects use nowadays. They had the titanic Arthropleura, over 7 feet long. At its time, it was the largest creature on land, and it remains the largest invertebrate ever to walk the earth. But you know what we call something that hasn't been important since the Carboniferous? Okay, I'm trying to think of a word other than that, but point being, its ship has sailed. It peaked long ago and it fell off straight down into C tier. The shipworm is a common nuisance. These worms have been around as long as wood has needed water to grow, and they've been a nuisance to humans as long as we've been putting wood in water to float. The shipworm is actually a type of clam, which, sans a shell, burrows into the hull of wooden boats. Because clams obviously don't have teeth or claws or anything hard to burrow with, it uses the vestigial remains of the shell, like a horn, to burrow through wood. The shipworm is not rare. It's been common throughout the history of seafaring. The first incident was in 350 BC in ancient Greece by Theophrastus. Can't believe we got clams that sink ships before the birth of Christ. Columbus's fourth voyage was brought down by shipworms, and they almost brought down the dikes of the Netherlands in 1730, and they remain significant threats nowadays. Even with metal-plated holes and chemical coatings, shipworms cost hundreds of millions of dollars in damage a year. Which, to be fair, is not that much on the global economic scale. If Elon Musk were to be eaten alive by shipworms, it would take them almost 400 years. Still, they're doing something, so I'll give them a B for billionaires for lunch. Now, an earworm is especially catchy music, one that gets stuck in your head on repeat, like It's Just a Burning Memory, or Kill Bill by SZA. Now, the earworm has a lot to answer for. First, why the name? What's its claim to being a worm? Well, the word earworm originally referred to moth larvae that infested ears of corn. It was the Germans who first came up with it being a song. It was, of course, called Ohrwurm in their tongue, which was also the name of an earwig, so named because it was used to cure ear disease. But back then, and still nowadays, people thought that that was because it crawled into your ear and made a nest in your brain, much like a catchy tune. So they got Ohrwurm in German and earworm in English. So how do we feel about them? Well, the figures I found tend to be two-thirds favorable and one-third unfavorable, which is probably a bit inaccurate because I don't imagine most people even feel that strongly about them. I think it depends a lot on the song. If it's a good song, most people don't mind. The most prevalent sources seem to be Queen and Lady Gaga. Now, I love Lady Gaga, but, and don't hate me for this, I'm not in love with Queen. It's a lot of naked guitar solos, and I'm more into the way all the instruments work together. And for me, I do love it when I can do a whole song in my head, but it's never a whole song. It's always one small part repeated ad nauseum. And maybe that's just my OCD that informs my general dislike of repeating certain phrases over and over in my head, but I do not care for an earworm. So, another D tier. But now, say hello to Spirobranchus giganteus, the giant twisted gills, aka the Christmas tree worm. Tis unfortunately not the season yet, but the Christmas tree worm is a species of annelid like the blood, giant tube, rag, and earthworms we previously covered. Out of all of these, it's closest to the tube worms, which are united in the order Sabellida, or the gravelly ones. Now, all of these have the two head segments, which I mentioned earlier, fused into one and have a whole beard of filaments emerging from them. This creates a variety of distinctive forms, variously identified as feather duster worms, peacock worms, and yes, Christmas tree worms. They're also very useful for filter feeding, as most of the species are what's called tube-building worms, where they anchor themselves down to coral or rock, coat themselves in rock to protect themselves, and let the feather thingies wave out to catch plankton. These worms are beautiful, and coral reefs wouldn't look the same without them. A tier. Now, although I selected mealworms for it, perhaps a better premiere for the insect larva would be the bagworm, a species of moth. This is so famous, it has a Pokemon line based on it. Does the mealworm have that? Thought so, loser. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have gone off on the mealworm like that. It's just, things have been so hard since my wife died. She was eaten alive by a gigantic guinea worm. That's why I ranked them so low. Anyway, the bagworm is called that because of the cocoon it surrounds itself in. More accurately, it does create a protective pupal casing made of silk, but it then augments this by adding various forms of debris it gathers, mostly pine needles, from its surroundings, which is referenced in the three different forms a Burmy can take. As an adult, the female never emerges from its pupal casing, as referenced by the female evolution Wormadam, but the male does, and it's entirely on the male to find a female before dying. And he better, because like most Lepidopterans, he dies nearly 2 days after emerging as an adult. You know, maybe at this point, I'm just jaded, and I'm considering everything as just default. Or maybe the bagworm actually is uninteresting, so I will take that C tier after all. And finally, yes, finally, there's only one way to end. Worms. The game. Now, I haven't actually played Worms. I don't really play console games, but I have played one of its many spiritual success. Okay, maybe it's not that highbrow. One of its many shameless ripoffs, Bad Eggs Online 2. I liked it. Honestly, the entire genre of what's called turn-based artillery games are right up my alley. I'm big into it. And Worms is the one what started it all, the one with the most different weapons and interactions, the biggest player base. Actually, those last two are only my assumptions because, like I said, I haven't actually played it yet. And I might never. I just discovered the Flash emulator that lets me play Cactus McCoy. Doesn't matter. It seems like a fun game. I'll give it an S tier to make up for the lower scores in this video. And that's it. Sorry to the computer worm and horseshoe worm, the only ones on the list I didn't care enough about to rank. So I guess just F tier for both. Whoops.